Undercover boss buys breakfast, freezes when waitress says she sleeps hungry every night. A Monday morning. It wasn't raining, but the gloomy sky made it feel like the entire city wasn't quite ready to wake up. Michael Cart, 50 Rials years old, CEO of the Sunrise Diner restaurant, chain-stepped out of a rented car, pulled his knit cap low, and tucked his hands deep into the pockets of his coat. He brought no assistant, no security team. Just himself, like an anonymous diner among a stream of everyday people. On paper, branch number 17 in the eastern suburb consistently reported stable revenue, positive customer reviews, no issues. But over the past 3 weeks, he'd received several anonymous messages sent through the internal feedback system. Shift schedules are being assigned unfairly. The one who works hardest never gets their fair share. Oh, we don't even know what we're trying so hard for anymore. Michael used to trust the numbers, but today, he wasn't there because of a report. He came to hear what wasn't in the data. The diner was still busy, tables packed, the scent of coffee, brown butter, and fried eggs filled the air. But something wasn't right. No one was talking. Staff moved like silent shadows, bringing food, clearing plates, then vanishing behind the counter. Only Sophia, a petite young waitress with her hair tied up in a faded elastic, stood out. She wasn't necessarily faster than the others, but there was something in her eyes, in the way she thanked customers, that caught Michael's attention. She greeted people evenly, yet not indifferently, took orders with precision, gently carried trays through narrow aisles without losing so much as a smile. But beneath that composed exterior was a tired face and movements that seemed strained. Michael sat by the window and ordered a simple breakfast. Then he looked around not to assess the service, but to find who here is trying the hardest, without anyone really noticing. And it seemed he was starting to find the answer. He glanced around once more before refocusing on the waitress pouring his coffee. It was her, Sophie. Small build, soft voice, but a steady pour, filling the cup exactly 3/4 full, like she'd done it 1,000 times. "Thank you," he said, then casually added as a gentle gesture, "Have you had breakfast yet?" The question was spoken simply, with no hidden meaning, but for a moment, her hand paused on the coffee pot handle. Sophie looked up and smiled faintly, a thin smile that left no trace on her face. Then she whispered, as if hoping her voice would dissolve into the clinking of spoons and cups around the diner, "Every night I go to bed with an empty stomach, but at least I still get to work." Michael didn't respond immediately. He nodded lightly, pretending to tear a piece of bread, but his eyes no longer focused on the plate. A simple sentence light as breath, yet it struck directly at the deepest things he once believed he had control over. Going to bed hungry, yet feeling lucky just because she still had a job. Michael had started out behind a stove, frying pastries with bare hands in the winter cold, and always prided himself that Sunrise Diner was a place where every person is seen and treated fairly. And now, in that very system, a worker was starving each day just to hold on to a position that was supposed to help her live better. Sophie didn't know what she had just said. She simply tilted her head slightly, poured coffee for another table, and continued spinning through her familiar serving rhythm, careful and invisible. As for Michael, he remained still. The toast had gone cold. The coffee wasn't hot anymore. But inside him, something had just ignited. Michael set the cup down. He didn't need more caffeine. What he needed now was the truth. From his small corner table by the window, he began watching more closely. Sophie never stopped moving. Every time she returned, it was to tend to something else. Table 4 needed water. Table 7 wanted to swap eggs. Table 10 was waiting to pay. 12 tables scattered across the room, she handled them all. No notepad, no backup, just sore feet, fast hands, and a forced smile barely holding together the dignity of a decent workday. Meanwhile, 2 other male staff, shirts crisp, hair slick, sat comfortably behind the counter. They only handled 2-3 easy tables, regulars, light orders, slow eaters. When someone got up to pay, one of them promptly stepped out with the handheld POS machine. Sophie always stepped back, gently, automatically, no explanation, as if she had been programmed to stay away from touching money. Michael leaned forward and unlocked his phone. With just a few verification steps, he accessed the Sunrise internal system using a master-level account 1 designed so that no one could deny the truth. The admin dashboard appeared. Michael typed in the branch name. Pose system permissions. Branch 42. Ryan L. ID R. Langford. Full pause access. Jason M. Pause subrole. Sophie T. No POS credentials assigned. Michael frowned. He navigated to the most recent system update. Patch ID 7.0.3, manual installation. Update date, 5 weeks ago, approved by D. Hayes, branch manager. Notes, optimize peak hour payment processes, reduce complex steps. Additional configuration, automatically redirect all digital tips under $15 to default ID. R. Langford. Michael stared at the name, R. Langford. This name didn't just show up here. He was the nephew of Doug Hayes, the branch manager, who once declared at a regional summit, "Sunrise is where every contribution is valued." And Sophie? No ID, no access credentials, no record of any kind. She had been erased from the system like she never existed in that morning's transactions. No need for forged receipts, no need to pocket cash. Just one system patch-in, one name missing from the list of those allowed to touch the POS machine. Michael closed his phone. In the distance, Sophie was still smiling at an elderly couple who had just left their table. The older woman slipped 2 small bills into her hand, but Sophie quietly returned them, saying, "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." Michael swallowed a breath of cold air, not out of anger, but because he knew what had just been revealed wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberately designed structure, cloaked in the language of optimization, created with one goal: to make people like Sophie kind, hardworking, and quiet become invisible. Michael didn't stand up, but mentally, he had already crossed the boundary of being just another customer. He reopened the shift handover map in the app, tracing average order processing times. Sophie's name didn't appear once. Every order she served was logged under either Ryan or Jason, those who only occasionally left the counter, but were always the ones to close out the transaction by processing payment. Michael pulled up the transaction history from the past 14 days. A number jumped out that made his skin crawl. 87% of transactions under $15 were processed under IDR Langford. Jason had less than 10%, and Sophie, 0%. He double-checked the POS login logs tracking who had access to the machine and when. Not a single login was registered to Sophie's name. She existed, but outside the data grid of the entire system. Disabled, erased from entitlements. Only obligations remained. And labor. At table 8, a child had just spilled a glass of milk. Sophie rushed over on instinct, using a clean towel to mop it up. The mother apologized, but Sophie bowed slightly and said, "It's okay. Kids will be kids." Her voice stayed calm. No complaint. No signs of frustration, even though one shoulder of her shirt was soaked. Michael saw kindness being exploited. A form of silent endurance turned into the default foundation others stepped on without a second thought. And perhaps what shook him most wasn't the sophistication of the system, but the realization that he too hadn't seen it. That girl Sophie had existed in many branches, with different names, but the same model. Working the hardest, being present the most, and being forgotten the easiest. A system programmed to reward those who touch the machine, instead of those who touch every plate, every coffee cup, every apologetic smile. Michael sighed. For the first time, not from exhaustion, but because he knew if he didn't act, what was happening in this small diner wouldn't just be injustice. It would be license theft. And the name behind it, Sunrise, would no longer stand for a new dawn, but become a shadow too long for people like Sophie to ever escape from. 1 week later, early morning at branch number 42. The sunlight had yet to pierce the fog glass windows, and the air inside the diner was already stretched tight like a taut string. All staff were present. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed. Something was about to break. 6:58 a.m. The door swung open. Michael Carter walked in. "No disguise. No questions." He strode straight into the center of the dining room with a face no one could ignore. Stern, composed, resolute. Behind him came Julia from HR, 2 internal auditors, and the head of the POS systems team. Doug Hayes' branch manager stood frozen next to a tray of freshly baked pastries. Ryan Langford, his nephew, still held the POS device, but his hands were visibly shaking. Michael didn't mince words. He gave a simple signal. Julia placed a small speaker on the counter. One press. The recording played aloud. "Just funnel all the tips into Ryan's ID. Sophie doesn't do anything anyway. She has no system access. Customers only remember who brings the machine. No one cares who brings the food. Why bother sharing? Just let the system run itself, as long as no one finds out." The words dropped into the room like a hammer, smashing the last threads of trust. A few employees fell silent, eyes drifting toward Sophie, who had frozen behind the hot tea tray, her gaze a swirl of confusion and humiliation. Michael opened his tablet. projecting the POS report onto the wall monitor. Total digital tips, $15 in the past 5 weeks, 512 transactions. Tips routed to IDR Langford, 100%. Name Sophie T. Not listed. Doug stepped forward, his voice trembling, grasping for some acceptable explanation. We were just trying to keep the system running smoothly. Mornings are hectic, everyone knows that. Michael didn't respond immediately. He looked at Doug as if he were staring at the most shameful part of his own past. Then he spoke, slowly, but as if each word was hammered into stone. You optimized the system so your nephew could take all the tips, while Safaithi, one serving 12 tables every morning, had to go to bed on an empty stomach. He paused, locking eyes with Doug. That's not optimization, that's theft. The entire dining room fell silent. No one dared move their cutlery. Customers sitting near the counter stopped chewing. Ryan clenched the POS device in his hand but said nothing. Julia stepped forward, declaring firmly, Doug Hayes and Ryan Langford are terminated effective immediately. All system access is revoked. Their files have been handed over to the legal department for internal fraud investigation. Ryan put down the device and stepped back with his head bowed. Doug stood still like a statue, eyes dim and unfocused. Michael turned. His gaze softened as it landed on Sophie. Sophie. She flinched slightly. I'd like you to come forward. She stepped out. No one clapped. No one spoke. But every eye followed the steps of the slender girl. And this time, there was no pity in their gaze. Only recognition, clear and complete. Sophie stood in the center of the room, no longer hiding in someone else's shadow, no longer afraid of being overlooked. Today, she didn't just represent a hard morning shift. Today, she was a voice for all those who had been erased from the system simply because they didn't know how to fight for their share. And for all those who chose silence because they believed their voice wasn't worth hearing. Michael gave a subtle nod. And in that moment before the entire diner, justice didn't need a speech. It only needed someone who had once been overlooked to be called by name the right way. The espresso machine still clicked quietly behind the counter, but no one paid it any mind. A middle-aged man folded his newspaper, looked up at Sophie with a quiet gaze, as if he'd just seen something he had once forgotten to notice in his life. Sophie stood there, no slouched shoulders, no bowed head, but she didn't try to appear strong either. She just was there in the truest sense, like someone who had been through enough silence to understand. Courage doesn't always mean speaking loudly. Sometimes, it's simply daring to step out of the shadows. A young staff member near the counter walked slowly toward her, hesitant. It was Kayla, a new hire just a month in. Sophie, I'm sorry I knew about the tips, but I didn't know what to do. Sophie turned toward her, no blame, no sigh. She simply placed a hand gently on Kayla's shoulder and shook her head. It's okay. You know now. That's enough. That moment rippled like a wave. Another employee, Tommy, quiet until No emerged from the kitchen and set down a tray of donuts. This one's for your morning shift. Don't go without food again. Michael saw everything. He didn't need to draft a sweeping reform plan, nor issue instant policy decrees. Instead, he turned to Julia and gave a subtle nod. She understood, walked over to the counter, removed the old crooked shift board, and replaced it with a new notice. Effective today. All employees shall have POS access according to their shift. Digital tips will be distributed based on actual tables served. All system changes must be transparent and publicly displayed on the front monitor. Sophie turned to Michael. You listened. Michael shook his head. Number, I just arrived late, but this time I didn't look away. Oh, and then he walked to the window side table, the very place he once sat, frozen by a whispered sentence that pierced through his suit like a blade. I go to bed with an empty stomach, but at least I still have a job. Now, no one lived off leftovers or hollow encouragement. Sophie stood in the middle of the diner, not to bear the weight of everything, but to do something she'd never dared before, to accept trust, to return fairness. And as one elderly guest exhaled after a sip of hot coffee, he murmured, finally, someone poured it into the hands of the one who truly deserved it. 1 month later, the sky was clear, and the early sunlight slid gently through the front glass of Sunrise Diner, branch number 42, casting a warm glow on the spotless tiled floor. There was no more sense of heaviness in the air, no more rushed footsteps out of fear of making mistakes, no more averted glances and silent head bows. Michael Carter pushed open the door. This time, he wasn't in disguise. He didn't bring a review team. He simply came back, as someone who had once listened and now returned to make sure that kindness was still alive and well. Right at the counter, an electronic screen was mounted with care above the shift board, displaying clearly, tip sharing policy. transparent, public, protected. Below it, a small line engraved into solid oak wood, built on truth, upheld by trust. From behind the counter, Sophie stepped out. She no longer wore the faded apron. Over her shoulders was a crisp, white button-down shirt, fastened to the collar. Her hair was no longer damp with sweat, but neatly tied in a bun. The name badge on her chest caught the light above the counter. Sophie T., branch manager. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she smiled. No more trembling, no more avoidance. That smileful, steady was proof of someone who had stepped out of the shadows through sheer courage. Michael nodded. He chose again the same table by the window, the spot where, just a month ago, he had sat and heard a whisper that clutched at his chest. "I go to bed every night with an empty stomach." But this time, instead of strained silence, a steaming cup of coffee was gently placed in front of him. No rush, no performance. Sophie sat across from him. She didn't bow her head. She didn't ask for permission. She was simply present, like someone who no longer needed an invitation to enter her own life. Michael lifted the cup, let the warmth soak into his fingers, then looked through the sunlit window pane. He spoke not loudly, but with clarity in every word. The most important things in a restaurant aren't on the menu. They are trust, they are dignity, and the courage to speak up, even when no one believes that voice has value. As time, a little boy walked past the front glass, pointed at the screen above the counter. "They share the money fairly here, right, Mom?" His mother nodded softly. Michael smiled. Then, he looked down at the cup of coffee in his hand, poured by the right person, at the right time, for the right reason. Under the angled sunlight streaming across the wooden table, the space seemed to slow down. Not because life was missing, but because everything had finally found its proper place. Sophie added a touch of milk to Michael's coffee gracefully, without hesitation, without the shyness from their first meeting. She didn't ask if he needed anything. Morish already knew. And Michael knew too. He was now sitting across from a completely different person. Not because Sophie had changed, but because, for the first time, the system had chosen to see the truest part of her. From behind, a new young employee walked up and bowed slightly to Sophie. "The new tip-sharing rule? I think it's really fair, ma'am. Thank you." Sophie simply nodded, unfazed by praise. She turned to Michael. "After that day, I still didn't believe I'd last long here. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I thought my voice wasn't loud enough." Michael set his coffee down and smiled gently. "Precisely because you thought that, you ended up speaking through your actions." He looked around. Guests were cheerfully placing orders. Laughter mingled with the clinking of dishes. Everything was vibrant but not chaotic. A kind of rhythm that didn't need oversight, only kindness placed in the right roles. A small board near the pause, now displayed in clear view. Every shift, every employee, every recorded type allocated transparently, fairly, and locked from any unauthorized changes, auditable only by the central compliance system. No more gray zones. No more perks for family or familiar names. Sophie sat upright, but not stiff. She looked at Michael not as a CEO, but as a quiet ally. "Maybe. What wears people down the most," she said, "isn't the amount of work. It's doing what's right and still being treated as invisible." Michael didn't reply right away. He glanced outside. The sun had now blanketed the sidewalk. An elderly gentleman Sophie had once served walked in. Upon seeing Michael, he paused and nodded. "Last time, I told that girl she shouldn't be washing cups on an empty stomach. Now I'm at ease. She's standing where she belongs." Michael let out a soft chuckle. He gently rotated the cup of coffee in his hand. The steam no longer curled heavily, but it was still warm enough to stir memory. A cup of hot coffee. It doesn't need to be recorded in the operations manual. It doesn't need to appear on a quarterly report. It only needs to be poured by the very hands once erased from the roster, and lifted by someone who once believed that silence was their only option. Today, at the very table where the story began, Michael understood. Justice doesn't need noise to exist. It only needs one person brave enough to step out of the shadows and another quiet enough to truly hear them.